The Galactic Empire had ruled the known galaxy for 12,000 years. They had conquered over 300 species and absorbed them into their civilization. They believed themselves to be the supreme power in existence. No species had ever successfully resisted them. No species had ever made them doubt their strength. They moved through the stars like gods, taking what they wanted and destroying what they did not need. When their expansion fleet discovered a small blue planet on the outer rim of an unremarkable spiral arm, they did not think much of it. Their scanners showed primitive technology, chemical rockets, basic nuclear power, radio signals that barely reached beyond their own solar system. The fleet commander, a decorated officer named, looked at the data and laughed. These creatures were barely worth the effort of conquest. But the Empire had protocols. Every inhabited world received the same message: surrender or face destruction. It was simple and efficient. Most species surrendered immediately. The few that resisted were crushed within days. Expected these humans to be no different. Captain Laura was 43 years old and had spent most of her adult life in space. She commanded the research vessel Horizon, a ship designed for science rather than war. Her crew of 42 scientists and engineers were stationed near Jupiter's moon Europa, studying the ice formations and searching for signs of microbial life. It was quiet work, peaceful work. Laura liked it that way. She was reviewing the morning reports when her communications officer, a young man named Tyler Grant, called out from his station. His voice was strange. Laura looked up and saw that his face had gone pale. He told her that they were receiving a transmission from the outer solar system. It was not from Earth. It was not from any human source. Laura walked to his station and listened. The message was in a language she had never heard, but it repeated in broken English after a moment. The translation was rough but clear enough. Humanity had 30 rotations to surrender all territory and submit to imperial rule. Failure to comply would result in total annihilation. She felt her heart stop for a moment. Then she ordered Tyler to confirm the source. He did. There were ships out there, dozens of them. They were larger than anything humanity had ever built. Within hours, the message had reached Earth. Every government, every news network, every person with a screen knew what was happening. The Terran Confederacy, the unified government that had formed after the climate wars of the previous century, called an emergency session. Leaders from every nation gathered in Geneva to decide the fate of their species. Admiral Peter Cole was 61 years old and had seen more conflict than he cared to remember. He had fought in the Mars colonial uprising. He had lost friends in the asteroid belt disputes. He had dedicated his life to protecting humanity from itself. Now he faced a threat from beyond the stars, and he found that he was not afraid. He was angry. He stood before the assembled leaders and argued against surrender. He pointed out that the aliens had given no evidence of their military capabilities. They had only made demands. For all humanity knew, those ships could be empty threats. He proposed that they gather more information before making any decision. Others disagreed. Some wanted to surrender immediately and hope for mercy. Some wanted to launch nuclear weapons at the alien fleet, even though they knew the missiles would take months to reach them. The chamber erupted in shouting and accusations. President Maria Santos called for order. She was 55 years old and had been elected on a platform of unity and reason. She had never imagined she would face a crisis like this, but she kept her composure. She announced that humanity would not surrender without understanding what they faced. She also announced that they would not attack without provocation. They would respond to the aliens and request a meeting. Laura was recalled to Earth along with her crew. She left the Horizon in orbit around Europa and took a shuttle back to the planet of her birth. She had not been home in 3 years. The blue oceans and green continents looked beautiful from space, and she felt a pain in her chest at the thought of them being destroyed. She was met at the landing facility by a man named Daniel Park. He was the Secretary of Defense, a position she had only heard about in news reports. He was calm and professional as he escorted her to a secure location beneath the mountains of what had once been called Colorado. There, he told her something that changed everything she thought she knew about her government. Humanity had known about alien civilizations for decades, not through contact, but through observation. Deep space telescopes had detected signs of massive structures around distant stars. Mathematical patterns in cosmic radiation suggested artificial origins. The Confederacy had kept this information classified to prevent panic, but they had also prepared. Quietly, secretly, they had developed technologies that the public knew nothing about. Daniel showed her the files, quantum-fold drives that could bend space and allow ships to travel vast distances in moments, electromagnetic pulse generators that could disable any electronic system within 100 kilometers, weapons that made nuclear bombs look like firecrackers. Humanity had not been sleeping while the stars watched them. They had been getting ready. The ambassador arrived on Earth 1 week later. His name was Overseer, and he was a towering figure covered in dark green scales. His eyes were yellow and cold. He walked with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. He expected to receive the surrender documents and return to his fleet before the day was over. Instead, he was met by President Santos and her delegation. She did not bow. She did not tremble. She looked him in the eyes and spoke clearly. Humanity was not ready to surrender. They needed to understand what the Empire could do before making such an important decision. She requested a demonstration of power. Was amused. He had encountered species that tried to delay their fate before. It never worked. But he saw no harm in showing these primitives exactly what awaited them if they refused to comply. He agreed to the demonstration. He would select a target and he would destroy it while they watched. Then they would understand that resistance was pointless. He returned to his ship and prepared. Laura watched him go from a window in the secure facility. Daniel stood beside her and asked what she was thinking. She told him that she was thinking about her crew on the horizon. She was thinking about her parents in their small house by the sea. She was thinking about every person on Earth who was looking up at the sky and wondering if tomorrow would come. Daniel put a hand on her shoulder. He told her that tomorrow would come. Humanity had faced extinction before. Ice ages, plagues, wars that killed millions. They had survived all of it. They would survive this too. Laura wanted to believe him. But as she watched the shuttle disappear into the clouds, she knew that the next few weeks would determine whether humanity had a future at all. Overseer selected an asteroid in the belt between Mars and Jupiter for his demonstration. It was a chunk of rock and ice about 2 kilometers wide, uninhabited, unimportant, but large enough to make his point clear. The flagship moved into position, and the escort fleet of 20 warships formed a protective ring around it. Every sensor humanity possessed was pointed at that location in space. The flagship was 3 kilometers long and shaped like a blade. Its hull was dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Along its spine ran a series of massive generators that pulsed with blue energy. Stood on the command deck and watched his crew prepare the primary weapon. He felt pride in the power his people had built. No species in the galaxy could match technology. These humans would learn that lesson today. On Earth, billions of people watched through screens. The Confederacy had decided to broadcast the demonstration to everyone. President Santos believed that humanity needed to see what they faced. Fear could be dangerous, but ignorance was worse. If people understood the threat, they would stand together. If they were kept in the dark, they would panic when the truth came out. Admiral Peter Cole watched from the command center beneath the Rocky Mountains. The room was filled with officers and analysts, all of them silent as they stared at the display screens. Beside him stood Commander Grace, his strategic operations officer. She was 38 years old and had one of the sharpest minds in the military. Her job was to analyze enemy capabilities and find weaknesses. She watched the flagship with intense focus. The weapon fired. A beam of concentrated plasma erupted from the flagship and crossed the distance to the asteroid in less than a second. The rock shattered into millions of fragments. Dust and debris spread outward in an expanding cloud. Where there had been a solid object moments before, there was now nothing but scattered rubble. His voice came through the communication channels. He told humanity that their cities would meet the same fate if they did not comply within 20 rotations. He told them that their weapons were toys compared to technology. He told them that resistance would only bring suffering. The broadcast ended. Across Earth, people reacted in different ways. Some cried, some prayed, some shouted in anger, some simply sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they had seen. But in the command center, Grace was not stunned. She was calculating. She had noticed something during the demonstration that the probably did not expect anyone to catch. She turned to Admiral Cole and spoke quietly so that only he could hear. The flagship had taken nearly 2 minutes to charge its primary weapon before firing. The beam was devastating at close range, but plasma dispersed over distance. At the range the demonstration occurred, the weapon was at full power. But if the asteroid had been farther away, the beam would have lost coherence and been far less effective. The flagship was powerful, but it was not invincible. Cole nodded slowly. He asked her what else she had observed. Grace told him that the escort ships had not moved during the entire demonstration. They had stayed in formation, protecting the flagship. That suggested the flagship was vulnerable while charging. It needed protection. That was a weakness they could exploit. President Santos called another emergency meeting that night. The leaders gathered once more, but the mood was different now. Fear had given way to grim determination. They had seen the enemy's strength. Now they needed to find a way to respond. Daniel Park presented a plan that had been developed over years of secret preparation. It was called Operation Lighthouse. The idea was simple but bold. Rather than surrender or fight a conventional war they could not win, humanity would deliver a warning of their own. They would show that Earth was not a helpless target. They would demonstrate capabilities that the aliens did not know existed. The plan required a ship fast enough to bypass the fleet. It required a crew brave enough to face almost certain death. And it required technology that had never been tested in actual combat. Laura volunteered before anyone asked her. She stood before the assembled leaders and said that she had spent her life exploring the unknown. This was just another form of exploration. Her crew on the horizon had already agreed to follow her. They understood the risks. They were ready. The horizon was brought back from Europa and taken to a secret facility on the dark side of the moon. There, engineers worked around the clock to retrofit the ship with experimental technology. The quantum fold drive was installed in the engine compartment. Electromagnetic pulse generators were mounted along the hull. The ship's sensors were upgraded to military specifications. In 2 weeks, the research vessel was transformed into something new. Laura spent those weeks training with her reduced crew of 12 volunteers. Her second-in-command was Lieutenant, a pilot who had once flown rescue missions through asteroid storms. He was calm under pressure and could handle any ship in any situation. Their chief engineer was Dr. Helen, the woman who had actually designed the quantum fold drive. She knew the technology better than anyone alive. If something went wrong, she was their best chance of survival. Meanwhile, on the flagship, received reports from his intelligence officers. They had been monitoring human communications since the fleet arrived. They expected to see panic and chaos. They expected to see governments turning against each other as species always did when faced with extinction. Instead, they saw something strange. The humans were not panicking. They were not fighting among themselves. They were quiet, organized, waiting. Their communications had become carefully controlled. Their military movements had stopped almost entirely. It was as if they were hiding something. Dismissed the reports at first. What could these primitives possibly hide that would matter? But as the days passed, the silence from Earth began to bother him. He had conquered dozens of worlds. He knew what desperation looked like. This was not desperation. This was something else. He ordered his ships to increase their scanning range. He wanted to know everything the humans were doing, but the scanners found nothing unusual. The human fleet was small and scattered. Their orbital defenses were minimal. Their ground installations were primitive. Everything matched the initial intelligence reports. Still could not shake the feeling that he was missing something important. For the first time in his 2 centuries of service, he felt a small seed of doubt take root in his mind. He told himself it was nothing. These were just humans. They would surrender soon enough. But deep down, he was no longer certain. The Horizon launched from the hidden facility at midnight. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just 12 people climbing aboard a ship that might become their coffin. Laura was the last to board. She stood at the airlock and looked back at the gray lunar surface one final time. Then she stepped inside and sealed the door behind her. Was already at the pilot's station, running through the pre-flight checklist. Helen was in the engine room, monitoring the quantum fold drive. The rest of the crew took their positions throughout the ship. They were scientists and engineers who had trained for 2 weeks to become soldiers. None of them had ever fired a weapon in combat. None of them had ever faced an enemy fleet, but they were ready to do whatever was necessary. The ship lifted off and moved away from the moon. For the first few hours, they traveled using conventional engines, staying below the detection threshold of sensors. Laura sat in the command chair and watched the stars drift past the viewports. She thought about her parents. She had recorded a message for them before leaving, telling them that she loved them and that she was proud to be their daughter. She hoped they would never have to receive it. Announced that they were approaching the engagement zone. The fleet was visible on sensors now, 20 warships surrounding the massive flagship. From this distance, the flagship looked like a mountain floating in space. Laura had seen images of it before, but seeing it in person was different. It seemed impossible that anything could be so large. Helen called from the engine room. The quantum fold drive was charged and ready. She reminded Laura that they had never tested this technology at such close range. The calculations said it would work, but calculations were not reality. There was a chance the ship would simply tear itself apart when they activated the drive. Laura acknowledged the warning. Then she ordered to begin the approach. The Horizon accelerated toward the fleet. Alarms immediately began sounding on the alien warships. They detected the small human vessel moving at high speed directly toward them. Weapons systems activated. Targeting computers locked on. But before any of them could fire, the Horizon vanished. The quantum fold drive bent space around the ship and moved it from one point to another without crossing the distance between. One moment the Horizon was 10,000 kilometers away. The next moment it was floating directly beside the flagship, so close that Laura could see the patterns on the hull plating. On the command deck of the flagship, stared at his display screens in disbelief. The human ship had appeared out of nowhere, bypassing his entire defensive perimeter. His weapons officers were shouting for permission to fire. His tactical officers were scrambling to understand what had happened. Chaos erupted across the bridge. Laura opened a communication channel on all frequencies. Her voice was calm and steady as she spoke. She told them that this was not an attack. It was a message. The Horizon released a single probe that drifted toward the flagship's hull. It attached itself with magnetic clamps and began transmitting data directly into the alien ship's computer systems. Inside the probe was a package of information that had been carefully selected by the best minds on Earth. The data showed recordings of human history, not the peaceful parts, not the achievements and celebrations. It showed the wars, the revolutions, the moments when humanity had been pushed to the edge of extinction and had pushed back with everything they had. It showed cities burning and rising from the ashes. It showed armies that refused to surrender even when defeat was certain. It showed ordinary people standing against overwhelming odds and somehow surviving. watched the recordings with growing unease. He saw humans fighting each other with terrible weapons. He saw them rebuilding after every disaster. He saw them adapting to environments that should have killed them. These were not the weak primitives his intelligence had described. These were survivors. These were creatures that did not know how to give up. Then Helen activated the electromagnetic pulse generator. She kept the power at minimum, just enough to make a point. The flagship's lights flickered and dimmed. Non-essential systems shut down. Navigation displays went dark. For exactly 30 seconds, the most powerful warship in the fleet was blind and helpless. Then the systems came back online. The lights returned to normal. The displays flickered back to life. Laura spoke again through the communication channel. She explained that the pulse could have been stronger, much stronger. It could have left the flagship drifting and powerless for hours or days. The human ship could have delivered weapons instead of data. They could have crippled the fleet in a single strike. But they had chosen not to. Humanity did not want war. They wanted to be understood. Listened in silence. His hands were trembling, though he would never admit it to his crew. He had felt something during those 30 seconds of darkness that he had not experienced in 200 years of service. Fear. Real fear. Not the cautious wariness he felt before a difficult battle, but the deep primal fear of facing something he did not understand. The Horizon's engines activated, plotted a course away from the fleet, and Helen began charging the quantum-fold drive for another jump. Laura gave one final message before they departed. She told to take the data they had provided back to his leaders. She told him to explain what had happened here. She told him that humanity was offering a choice. Then the Horizon vanished again, reappearing safely near Mars a moment later. The crew sat in stunned silence for a long moment, then started laughing. It was the relieved laughter of someone who had expected to die and had somehow survived. Helen emerged from the engine room with tears streaming down her face. The rest of the crew began cheering and embracing each other. Laura did not celebrate. She sat in the command chair and stared at the distant stars. They had delivered their warning. Now they had to wait and see if it would be enough. On the flagship stood alone on the command deck. His officers had restored all systems and were demanding orders. The human ship had escaped. They wanted to pursue. They wanted to destroy the creatures who had humiliated them. But said nothing. He was still looking at the data the humans had sent. He was looking at the recordings of their history. He was looking at a species that had spent its entire existence fighting and surviving and refusing to accept defeat. And for the first time in his long career, he was not certain that victory was possible. Overseer faced the most difficult decision of his career. His orders from the Empire were clear: subjugate the planet or destroy it. There was no third option in protocol. Species either submitted to imperial rule or they ceased to exist. That was how the Empire had maintained control for 12,000 years. That was how order was preserved across 300 worlds. But the humans had changed the calculation. They had demonstrated capabilities that his intelligence had completely missed. They had appeared beside his flagship without warning. They had disabled his systems with technology he did not understand. And worst of all, they had chosen not to destroy him when they had the chance. That restraint bothered more than anything else. Conquered species did not show restraint. Desperate species lashed out with everything they had, but the humans had held back. They had delivered a warning instead of an attack. That spoke of confidence. That spoke of strength they had not yet revealed. He requested a communication link with the Imperial Council on Prime. There was thousands of light years away, but quantum relay stations allowed instant communication across any distance. Within minutes, his request was approved. The 12 elders who ruled the Empire would hear his report. High Counselor was the oldest and most powerful member of the council. He had served for nearly 500 years and had overseen the conquest of more than 50 worlds. His scales were pale with age, but his yellow eyes remained sharp. He listened to his report without interruption, studying the data from the human probe with careful attention. The other counselors reacted with outrage. How dare these primitives threaten an imperial fleet? How dare they humiliate an overseer with their tricks? They demanded immediate retaliation. They wanted the human planet reduced to ash as an example to any other species that might consider resistance. Remained silent while the others argued. On Earth, President Santos prepared for the possibility that the warning had not been enough. She hoped for peace, but she was not foolish enough to rely on hope alone. Admiral Cole activated the global defense network that humanity had built in secret over 3 decades. Orbital platforms emerged from hidden positions around the planet. They were armed with weapons that could strike targets in deep space. Missile installations revealed themselves on every continent, their warheads carrying payloads far more destructive than anything publicly acknowledged. And from shipyards concealed in the asteroid belt and on the moons of Jupiter, a fleet of warships launched for the first time. Commander Grace coordinated the defense preparations from the command center. She worked without sleep for 3 days, positioning assets and running simulations. She calculated every possible attack vector and developed responses for each one. The odds were still against them, but the odds were better than anyone had expected a month ago. Laura and her crew returned to Earth as heroes. News networks broadcast their faces across the planet. People gathered in the streets to celebrate the successful mission. For the first time since the aliens arrived, humanity felt something other than fear. But Laura did not feel like celebrating. She sat in a quiet room in the secure facility and stared at the wall, found her there after searching for an hour. He sat down beside her and asked what was wrong. She told him that nothing was decided yet. They had delivered a warning, but warnings could be ignored. They might choose to attack anyway. Everything they had done might have only delayed the inevitable. She could not celebrate while the fate of her species remained uncertain. Understood. He told her that was exactly why she was the right person to lead the mission. She thought about consequences. She considered possibilities. She did not assume that success meant the fight was over. Those were the qualities that would keep humanity alive if war came. Helen joined them a few minutes later. She had been analyzing the data from the mission, studying the ship's reactions to their technology. She believed the electromagnetic pulse had revealed more than they intended. The systems had taken 30 seconds to recover, which meant their electronics were not hardened against that type of attack. If humanity built enough pulse generators, they could potentially disable the entire fleet. It was a small advantage, but it was something. Laura felt a tiny spark of hope return. On Prime, the council debate continued for hours. The younger counselors grew more aggressive as time passed. They saw the human warning as an insult that demanded punishment. They argued that showing mercy would make the Empire appear weak. Other subjugated species would see the hesitation and begin to question their obedience. But finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but everyone fell silent to hear him. He reminded the council that the Empire had not survived 12,000 years through blind aggression. They had survived through careful assessment of threats and opportunities. They had learned when to fight and when to negotiate. They had recognized that some species were worth more as allies than as slaves. The humans had shown remarkable capability in a short time. They had developed technology that matched or exceeded systems in some areas. More importantly, they had shown wisdom in how they used that technology. They could have attacked. They could have started a war. Instead, they had offered information and requested understanding. That was not the behavior of primitives. That was the behavior of a civilization worth respecting. Proposed a different approach. He would send a second delegation to the human world. This time, they would offer negotiation instead of subjugation. They would explore the possibility of an alliance rather than conquest. But he made one thing clear. If the humans refused to negotiate, or if their warning proved to be a deception designed to buy time, the full might of the Empire would descend upon them. There would be no third chance. The council voted. The motion passed by a narrow margin, received new orders within the hour. He was to stand down his fleet and await the arrival of Ambassador, a diplomat known for brokering peace with 17 species. The invasion was postponed. When the news reached Earth, President Santos allowed herself a moment of relief, but only a moment. They were not retreating, they were reconsidering. That was better than war, but it was not peace. The real negotiation was about to begin. The second delegation arrived 3 weeks after the warning mission. Their ship was different from the warships that had threatened Earth. It was white and elegant, designed for diplomacy rather than destruction. It descended through the atmosphere and landed in Geneva, the same city where humanity had first the Empire's demands. Overseer emerged first, his expression unreadable. Behind him walked Ambassador, a smaller with lighter green scales and eyes that seemed almost gentle. Had spent 3 centuries traveling between worlds, negotiating treaties, and finding common ground between species that had never imagined coexistence. She was considered the finest diplomat in the Empire. President Maria Santos waited at the landing site with her delegation. Admiral Peter Cole stood to her right, his uniform decorated with medals from conflicts that now seemed trivial compared to what they faced. Secretary Daniel Park stood to her left, carrying a briefcase filled with documents that represented years of preparation for this moment. The two groups approached each other across the landing pad. For a moment, no one spoke. Humans studied each other in the morning sunlight, then performed a gesture that clearly did not expect. She lowered her head slightly, a sign of respect that typically reserved for equals. Santos returned the gesture. Then she invited the delegation inside. The negotiations took place in a conference room overlooking the lake. The windows were open, and a warm breeze carried the sounds of the city below. People were going about their lives, working and laughing and living, unaware that the future of their species was being decided in the building above them. Presented the Empire's offer. Humanity would be granted provisional membership in the galactic community. They would be allowed to trade with other species and travel to other worlds. They would receive protection from threats they did not yet know existed. In exchange, they would be required to share their quantum-fold technology with the Empire. They would also be required to provide consultation on their unique biological and psychological traits, which had clearly contributed to their rapid technological development. Santos listened carefully to every word. Then she asked for time to consult with her advisors, agreed, and to their ship for the night. In the secure room beneath the conference center, Santos met with her inner circle. Cole argued that the offer was better than they had any right to expect. They could have simply attacked. Instead, they were offering partnership. Park was more cautious. He pointed out that sharing the quantum-fold technology would eliminate humanity's primary advantage. If they had access to that technology, Earth would lose its ability to threaten their fleet. Laura was present as an advisor, given her experience with the warning mission. She offered a different perspective. They had not asked for surrender. They had not demanded obedience. They were treating humanity as a potential partner rather than a subject race. That meant they had learned something from the warning. They understood that humans were not the weak primitives they had first assumed. But Laura also warned against trusting too quickly. The Empire had conquered 300 species. Their idea of partnership might not match what humanity expected. They needed safeguards. They needed time to verify that they would honor their agreements. Santos made her decision overnight. In the morning, she returned to the conference room and presented a counteroffer. Humanity would agree to a 10-year period of limited cooperation. During that time, they would exchange cultural and scientific information. They would allow observers on Earth and send human observers to worlds. But technology sharing would only begin after mutual confidence was established. Trust had to be earned on both sides. considered the proposal for a long moment. Then she smiled, an expression that looked strange on her reptilian features but somehow conveyed genuine warmth. She told Santos that this was exactly the response she had hoped to hear. A species that surrendered everything immediately could not be trusted to honor long-term agreements, but a species that demanded fair terms showed the wisdom to be a true partner. She accepted the counteroffer on behalf of the Empire. The news spread across Earth within hours. People gathered in streets and squares to celebrate. Some wept with relief, others shouted with joy. After weeks of fear and uncertainty, humanity had secured its place among the stars without firing a single shot. Laura was appointed as humanity's first ambassador to the Empire. She would travel aboard a vessel to there and observe their civilization firsthand. Her reports would help Earth understand the galaxy they were joining, and Helen volunteered to accompany her as advisors. Before departing, Laura visited a small memorial near the launch facility where the first human astronauts were honored. She stood before the stone pillar that listed their names and remembered why her species had reached for the stars in the first place. It was not for conquest. It was not for power. It was because humans could not look at the night sky without wondering what lay beyond. That curiosity, that drive to explore and understand, had carried them from caves to cities to other worlds. Now it would carry them to the far reaches of the galaxy. On Prime, High Counselor reviewed the final terms of the agreement. He admitted privately to his closest advisors that the Empire had made an error in judgment. They had looked at Earth and seen a primitive world ripe for conquest. They had not looked closely enough. The humans were not like the other species the Empire had encountered. They did not seek to dominate. They did not surrender when threatened. They found a third path, one that preserved their independence while opening doors to cooperation. That required intelligence. That required courage. That required a kind of wisdom that had rarely seen in his 5 centuries of service. He watched the human ambassador arrive on his world through a viewing screen. Laura walked down the ramp of the diplomatic vessel with her head held high. She did not show fear. She did not show arrogance. She looked around at the alien city with genuine curiosity, as if she were a scientist discovering a new phenomenon. Understood then that the galaxy would never be the same. The Empire had operated under dominance for 12,000 years. They had believed themselves to be the supreme civilization, but the equation had changed. A small species from an unremarkable planet on the outer rim had announced itself not as a subject race, but as an equal. And the Empire, for the first time in its long history, would have to learn to share the stars.